Welcome to day one of our two-day Council of Holocaust Educators, now 19th annual conference. This year's conference is titled Life After Liberation, the Continuance of Violence. For those of you who are new to CHE, welcome. It doesn't normally look like this. And for our veteran educators, welcome back. We have facilitated many CHE conferences over the years, but this is our first fully virtual experience. And we're excited to be here with you. Hopefully this will be our first and last fully virtual, although I'm open to the idea of a hybrid model for the future. My name is Sarah Brown, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education. Before I continue, I want to recognize that our center is housed on the occupied territory of the Lenape people. Now, the focus of this year's conference, examining survivor experiences after liberation, and then thinking of creative and innovative ways to incorporate them into Holocaust education, this speaks to Change's commitment to tell the human experience of genocide, the full life history. And this includes experiences pre and post-genocide for both our victims and our survivors of the Holocaust and other instances of genocide too. This is so important, maybe now more than ever, especially as we witness a resurgence of anti-Semitism, extremism, and prejudice around the country, but also around the globe. This is the time for us to come together and promote the elimination of anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of prejudice through innovative education about the Holocaust, including and also other instances of genocide and human rights. So thank you. By being here, you're playing your part, and I really want to honor that and respect that, and thank you for being here. For the past 40 years, 41 actually this year, Change has provided educational resources for teaching and studying the Holocaust, modern genocides, and human rights violations around the world. And since we've transitioned to a virtual platform back in March, we have now provided nearly 40 programs. I believe by tomorrow it will be 40 programs that have educated, inspired, and empowered individuals across 5 continents. Please visit our website, change.org, that's change with 2 H's, to learn more about our available resources to support virtual learning and teaching, to view our calendar of programs, or to book a virtual tour of our exhibit, Journeys Beyond Genocide, the Human Experience. Our center remains closed for now, but we are continuing to innovate. And someday soon, we're excited to welcome you back to visit the center, visit our experience, our exhibit, visit our 6,000 volume library, and also see our archives, the only one in the state for Holocaust and genocide. Now, briefly before I introduce our tremendous keynote speaker for tonight, I would be remiss if I did not thank the amazing people behind this conference. So huge, huge, huge thanks to the entire Council of Holocaust Educators, your executive board. You've been so supportive and so creative, and you innovated with us. You were partners in this, and that is just, I appreciate it. Each year, it's so much fun working with you. This year was a little unusual, but we did it. Warm thanks also to Nicole Rizzuto and Ali Evans for helping to make this conference possible. Okay, we're all seated, we're comfortable, we're ready to go. Let's cover some very quick housekeeping items. So your audio is muted, but your chat feature is enabled. So at the end of our keynote presentation, when we have our question and answer period, please feel free to type your questions into the box and we'll get to as many as possible. Today, you're going to be hearing from a tremendous historian, Dr. Joanna Sliwa. Dr. Sliwa is a historian of the Holocaust and Polish Jewish history, and she is also an educator. She works as a historian at the Conference on Jewish Claims Against Germany, the Claims Conference, and she is also the author, I just found out, of the forthcoming book, Jewish Childhood in Krakow, a microhistory of the Holocaust. Previously, Dr. Sliwa worked as a project specialist in the archives department at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and as assistant manager of the FASPE, the Fellowships at Auschwitz for the Study of Professional Ethics at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And I have to note, this is me going off script, but Dr. Sliwa is also my doctor sister. We both completed our PhDs at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and enjoyed the privilege of having Dr. Deborah Dwork on our dissertation committees. And so it is my extra personal and professional pleasure to welcome Dr. Sliwa to tonight's program. Now, I'm going to hand the reins over to you, and I'm going to mute myself. So welcome, Dr. Sliwa.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you, Sarah, for this very generous, beautiful introduction. Welcome, everyone. And I, as I was scrolling through, I saw and looking at the little windows, I saw so many familiar faces and names. So I am excited that you are all here. And for those of you with whom we didn't meet yet, I hope this is a good opportunity to meet. So welcome, everyone. I would like to thank the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education and the Council of Holocaust Educators for the invitation to speak and for this opportunity to be with you here today. I will now share my screen with you. Okay, so we will begin with the story of Emanuel Elbinger, and you see him to the far right. I knew him as Mundek. Emanuel was 14 years old in January 1945 when he emerged from his hiding place near his hometown of Nowe Brzesko in southern Poland. And you see it in red, the location of his hometown and the area where he hid during World War II. Out of his 5-member immediate family, only Emanuel, his then 12-year-old sister Paula, you see her pictured in the middle, and the children's father, Bernard, survived. And they did so with the help of Polish peasants. However, other local Poles behaved differently. The Polish couple who at first agreed to shelter Emanuel's 6-year-old sister Lucia, and you see her picture to the far left, the couple brought her to a collection place during the liquidation of the town's ghetto. In September 1942, Lucia was killed by the Germans. Local Polish partisans murdered Emanuel's mother, Rosalia, while she was trying to obtain food for the family. And this murder happened in December 1944, a month before liberation. Even after that, even after liberation, Jewish survivors continued to face threats to their lives. In Nowe Brzesko, where Emanuel returned post-liberation, Polish men attempted to kill another surviving Jewish family. Emanuel stated in one post-war testimony, and I quote, "We were exhausted, sick, and still in danger." And in another testimony, he deplored, and I quote, "After the war, all sorts of unpleasant things carried on happening in the town. It was like a continuation of the war." And here I want to show you websites with testimonies that contain testimonies of Emanuel Elbinger. And throughout this presentation, I will show you different resources that you may find useful to use in your own teaching. And these are resources that are readily available online. So there's this ease of accessibility, right? And you can use them with your students. The first one that I would like to point out is a testimony that Emanuel submitted in 1992, and this one is available through Google Books. Emanuel's sister Paula also submitted a testimony in the same book, and that section follows Emanuel's account. And here on the side panel, I noted that for Paula's testimony, you will also find a translation of her immediate post-war account that she submitted in 1946 to the Central Jewish Historical Commission. So you have a testimony and you have an archival document if you would like to use that with your students to compare testimonies, to see what elements were covered in a testimony from 1946 versus 1992. And the second The second example of Emmanuel's testimony is from Centropa. And I'm sure many of you already know about this wonderful resource where you can find a treasure trove of information, and you see in the tabs examples of what you can find. So one example, of course, is Emanuel Elbinger's it's relatively long and detailed testimony about his pre-war life, what happened to him during the war, and also what happened to him after the war. But back to our story. So liberation, as we saw in Emmanuel's case, did not end suffering. Liberation did not mark an immediate return to peace. Liberation did not create awareness of the Jews' losses. For all Jews in Poland, such as Emmanuel, liberation marked a continuation of civil unrest, of violence, of anti-Semitism that carried over from the wartime. But these phenomena, civil unrest, violence, anti-Semitism, were also exacerbated by post-war realities. In my presentation today, I will focus, of course, on the theme of this conference, which is the continuance of violence after liberation as World War II was ending. And I would like to focus on a set of questions. This is something for all of us to keep in mind as I will go through the talk. So our main questions are, one, what did liberation mean to Jewish survivors in Poland? Two, what dangers did Jewish survivors face in Poland in the first years after the Holocaust? Three, why were Jewish survivors targeted after the war? And four, how did Jewish survivors respond to violence? So these are our main questions. But the larger questions that we should also keep in mind throughout are what happens in the aftermath of violence and armed conflict? What happens to a fragmented society that is ravaged by wartime violence? Another question to keep in mind is what are the consequences of ethnic and religious divisions? And the fourth question, how do myths and conspiracy theories fuel hatred and lead to violence? We will look at the types of violence against Jewish survivors. And to do that, I will zoom in, as you already know, on one geographic area, on Poland. But first, before we do that, we will step back to review very briefly what happened in Poland during World War II and upon liberation. And for those of you who know me and from some of my previous presentations, I love to show maps. And so you will see several of those maps. They're all from the Holocaust Museum website, and it's a highly useful resource. So I encourage you to take a look, to explore, and to use it. First thing to keep in mind is that Poland endured a double invasion and double occupation. First, Germany attacked Poland from the west on September 1st, 1939. Then the Soviet Union attacked from the east on September 17, 1939. Poland ceased to exist by the end of September 1939, and you see in yellow the demarcation line. Eastern Poland remained under Soviet control until Germany attacked the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. And on this map, you see the direction of the invasion and the occupation of the Eastern territories by the German army. the Soviet army began to liberate Eastern Poland already in summer 1944. The gradual liberation of Poland was accompanied by violence against civilians and extensive plunder by Red Army soldiers. Stalin imposed a communist regime in the newly freed Polish territories. For all these reasons, so we have violence against civilians, plunder by Red Army soldiers, the establishment of a communist regime in Polish territories. For these reasons, many Poles considered the Soviet arrival not liberation, but another occupation. By 1945, Poland was a changed country. Borders shifted. And here on this map, you see how much they shifted. So the borders in yellow, those are pre-war borders of Poland. And you see the territories to the right that were ceded to the Soviet Union. Those are the eastern borderlands. And then Poland gained territories in the west that used to be Germany. So Poland as a country changed in terms of borders, but Poland as a country also changed in terms of population. After the war, it was largely a mono-ethnic, mono-religious country. 3 million Jews, so 90% of Poland's pre-war Jewish population, including Emanuel Elbinger's sister and mother, were murdered in the Holocaust. So 90% of Poland's pre-war Jewish population was no more. About 300,000 Polish Jews survived. Of these, 200,000 survived in the Soviet Union, and they returned to Poland after the war. In 1939, there were about 1.5 million Jewish children in Poland. By 1945, the number of them was about 5,000. So 5,000 children, including Emanuel and his sister Paula, survived in German-occupied Poland. So you can see the extensive losses suffered by the Jewish population and by Poland during the war. Many child survivors required medical attention. After hiding in a confined space for over 2 years, Emanuel Elbinger had trouble walking. His sister Paula needed psychological help. Their father was unable to care for his children. So he placed Emanuel and Paula in a children's home in the city of Kraków, where there was a growing Jewish community and where the Jews, with help from international organizations, created initiatives to support survivors. And in this picture here, you see Paula on the left and Emanuel kind of in a resort town in Zakopane, about which I will now say a little bit more. So from Kraków, the children, Paula and Emanuel, were transferred to Zakopane, which is a town in the mountains of southern Poland. And of course, this is from the winter time that you see Emanuel here. And just to give you the location of the town, you have it marked in blue, in the blue circle, Zakopane, and you see the view from today, which is, it's a beautiful view. People go there to recuperate. And so this is where, in Zakopane, this is where a children's home for Jewish children was established. But even there, the children and staff were not spared from violence. The director of the children's home, and you see her pictured here, Lena Kichler, she explained that the children from the Jewish children's home could not go outside because the Polish children harassed them. Polish men robbed, beat, and assaulted Kichler on the streets. Polish paramilitary formations shelled the Jewish children's home. In response, Kichler organized a self-defense crew. She had machine guns installed on the roof of the children's home. She also made sure there was an alarm siren, there were searchlights. So this already tells us that the Jewish children, were not safe, even in this resort town. What I want to point out on the slide is a book by Lena Kichler-Zilberman, My 100 Children. And I know Colleen knows this book very well. She spoke about it many times, so she can say a little bit more and perhaps how to use it in the classroom later on. And I also want to point out 2 films that were made about Lena Kichler and her efforts to help Jewish child survivors after the war. One is a documentary film that is the more recent one from 2003, and it includes clips with child survivors. And the other film is a feature film from 1987. It's available on a public platform, and so you can view that if you'd like. Now, who were the perpetrators who shelled this Jewish children's home in Zakopane? They were members, you see young men, members of a partisan group, anti-communist partisan group. Their leader, you see him in the middle, Józef Kuras, pseudonym Ogień, fire. The situation of the children's home in Zakopane was not an exception. In the nearby town of Rabka, and you see again Rabka marked in that blue circle, over 100 very ill Jewish child survivors suffered a series of attacks in summer 1945. And you see they lived in 3 they were called villas, these kind of, because this is a resort town, Rabka is a resort town. So there, people stayed in these villas, these hotels, and there were 3 of them where Jewish children stayed. And you see an example of one such villa in today's state, in today's condition, right? But it gives you some idea. The perpetrators in this case were local Poles under the leadership of a priest. And so in fear of future attacks, the children from this home in Rabka were transferred to the center in Zakopane. Emmanuel Elbinger recalled how positive his stay was in the children's home in Zakopane. It was positive for him because he managed to return to his health and he was able to acquire an education. However, the children's home in Zakopane closed at the end of 1945. So it existed for less than a year because of the threat to the safety of the children and the staff who cared for them. And I'm sure one question that lingers is, what drove these ordinary Poles to target Jewish children, Jewish child survivors? And here I would like to focus on two reasons. One is the myth of Judeo-communism or Jewish communism. This legend originated long before World War II and the Holocaust. In essence, this myth conflates Jews as a group with ideology, communism. As Jews, the children embodied the hated enemy, the communist regime. And I mentioned to you, I showed you the picture of the men, right? The attackers of the children's home in Zakopane, they belonged to an anti-communist partisan group. And so they were attacking a children's home, a Jewish children's home, because the children and the staff were Jewish, and they represented the hated enemy. Even during the war, many Poles accused Jews of being communists and of welcoming Soviet soldiers in 1939. In 1941, when Nazi Germany took over the eastern territories of Poland, some local Poles took revenge on the Jews, even murdering them. So you see the strength of this myth of Judeo-communism. After the war, some Jews who had been communists even before the war and who survived in the Soviet Union returned to Poland. And they took up positions in the communist government. The visibility of Jews in these high-level administrative positions, including in the brutal Secret Service, that confirmed many Poles that Jews were in fact responsible for the terror of the communist regime. So this is one reason why the Jewish children's home was attacked, the myth of Judeo-communism. The second reason it was to threaten the Jews, to induce fear, to inhibit them from settling down in Poland, to push them to move out of Poland. And this was not new. The plan to force Jews out of Poland was a continuation of Poland's pre-war efforts to make Jews, to push Jews, to make Jews to emigrate out of the country and somewhere else. The reappearance of Jews after the Holocaust posed problems for many Poles, especially for those Poles who had enriched themselves by taking over businesses, homes, and possessions of Jews during the war. Some Poles were motivated by the myth of Jewish wealth and also by the belief that Jews were exploiting the Poles. At the beginning of this session, I mentioned the story of the Jewish family in Nowe Brzesko that was the target of Polish attackers. Immanuel Elbinger explained that that family was spared death only because the attackers accidentally entered another apartment. So Jewish survivors who returned to their homes after the war were often in danger of being injured and in danger of death. And here I would like to point out a relatively new resource that you may find interesting, and that is, this is from the website of the World Jewish Restitution Organization. And recently, the WJRO did an initiative called My Property Story, where they collected stories of survivors and their descendants of return home and of trying to establish their lives, of trying to reclaim their homes, their businesses, and what happened to these survivors. And you see examples here. You have videos, very short videos. There are also story accounts of survivors with photographs. And there are also stories as told by children and grandchildren of survivors. So this is another way of, I think, of telling survivor stories and also of using testimonies in the classroom. Returning Jewish survivors were met with little sympathy, as we have already heard. Poles murdered even up to 1,000 Jewish survivors between the years 1944 and 1946. So between those few years after the war, about up to 1,000 Jewish survivors were killed by Poles. These Jews were murdered upon return to their homes, while attempting to claim their property, and while traveling on trains. Jewish survivors were also assaulted and murdered in organized attacks called pogroms that swept through Poland. One of them, in particular, sent shockwaves among survivors. At the beginning of July 1946, actually July 1st, 1946, a 9-year-old Polish boy, Henryk Błaszczyk, left his home in Kielce, in the city of Kielce, and you have it marked on the map with the red pin. He left Kielce without telling his parents. When he returned a few days later, Henryk's father told the police that his son was kidnapped and hidden in the basement of the local Jewish committee building. Now, this is the local Jewish committee building from 1946 that you see here, and you see a river, right? So how could there be a basement in the committee building when there is a river here, right? That's impossible. Indeed, there was no basement in the building. However, the rumor spread in the city that the Jews kidnapped Henryk and kept him in the basement. At that time, there were about 180 Jewish survivors. Many of them lived in this Jewish community building because they had nowhere else to go. They had nothing. But these Jewish survivors were accused of this centuries-old myth of blood libel, right? That they were kidnapping, the Jews were kidnapping Christian children and drawing their blood to use in matzah, right? In matzah, in the unleavened bread the Jews eat for Passover. Now, July is not a month for Passover, right? That Passover occurs much earlier than July. But the myth that Jews kidnap Christian children and use their blood, in this case, perhaps to fortify themselves, right? After suffering, they needed to fortify themselves, strengthen their bodies, right? That myth was so strong that a crowd of angry Poles, including around 1,000 workers from the nearby steel mill, gathered outside the Jewish community building, shouting against the Jews and inciting violence. Moreover, policemen and soldiers in a way facilitated this pogrom because their presence there legitimized the rumor, and the policemen and the army did nothing to stop this attack against the Jewish survivors. In a matter of one day, the Poles killed 42 Jewish survivors, and more than 40 other Jews sustained injuries. The Kielce pogrom instilled fear in a community that was already traumatized by the war years. In the 3 months after the pogrom, over 75,000 Jews left Poland. That's a huge number. In only 3 months, 75,000 Jews left Poland across the border, and they went into DP camps, mainly in Germany. Among those who considered leaving was Emanuel Elbinger's father. His father realized that changing his name to a more Polish sounding was not enough to stave off anti-Semitism. So Emanuel's father was making arrangements through an organization the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, to emigrate. And the JDC established an office for it to help Jews emigrate from Poland, to facilitate their immigration, help them with paperwork. The JDC established an office in Warsaw. And so the family, the Elbinger family, was to leave for Belgium in 1948. However, Emmanuel's father fell ill, and the immigration plans never came to fruition. And here you see the immigration card for the Elbinger family. You can find this card as well as a host of other very interesting and useful resources on the JDC Archives website. And I encourage you to visit the website. The website includes also galleries, photo galleries by topic. So for example, there are galleries related to DP camps, displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria. So it gives, if you're looking for materials to present in your classrooms of what life was like for these survivors, this is a good place to look. The archives also drafted these teaching materials with resources from the archive, so documents in English that are accessible, that are short, and that are geared for high school, mainly high school students. I don't know if you could use them for middle school, but mainly for high school students and college as well. Emmanuel had a surviving parent. He hid during the war with his father. In many other cases, children hid separately from their parents. And rarely did both parents survive. Child survivors were left with one parent, if they were lucky, or what was more common, they were orphaned. Often a battle ensued over the custody of the child. And here I would like to mention the example of Ita Lea Eigenfeld. Ita Lea, and you see her photograph on the left. Ita was born in summer 1941 in the Lublin area in eastern Poland. And on the map, you see Lublin marked. Ita's mother, Rachela, hid in the forest in the Lublin area. Unable to care for her baby daughter, she placed her 15-month-old daughter in a village with a note that the girl was baptized, a note that specified the girl's name, Leona, and the mother left markings on the girl's body so that she could identify her child after the war. The Lublin area was liberated earlier than the rest of Poland in summer 1944. By July 1944, that area was freed. And so the mother, Rachela, wanted to reclaim her daughter from the peasant family. She was unsuccessful. The foster parents would not give up the child. So the mother sued the couple in a Polish court. She was unsuccessful again. Rachela did not want to stay in Poland. She decided that she would fight for her child from abroad. Rachela went first to Germany, to the DP camp. She then immigrated to Canada. And so from Canada, she continued her efforts to reclaim her daughter. And she used the help of Jewish organizations to do that. Finally, in the mid-1950s, the Polish Supreme Court ruled that Ita Lea, Leonka, should return to her mother in Canada. And that is when the mother and daughter reunited after many years. I mentioned this story because children who were caught in these battles, these court battles, endured psychological violence. Sometimes they were forcibly kept by their wartime protectors. Other children were torn from their foster parents. They were pushed into the care of Jewish relatives whom they often didn't know or barely knew. Children entered Jewish homes, Jewish children's homes, and they were expected to be Jewish when all they had known to survive was how not to be Jewish. At the same time, these Jewish children were the surviving remnants. They symbolized a Jewish future, and they were seen as a national asset for the Jewish people. They belonged to the Jews. No discussion of this, of the topic of post-war violence would be complete without mentioning how Jewish survivors responded to post-war violence. Some Jews, such as the Elbingers, changed their names to appear less Jewish. We heard about the self-defense that Lena Kichler implemented in the children's home. Jewish survivors, such as the Elbingers, fled from small towns to larger cities. And then most other Jews fled from Poland altogether. That was a response to violence. In some cases, Jewish survivors sought the protection of government officials, of the police, of the army. At times they were successful, at other times they were not. As was the case with Ita Lea Eigenfeld, Jewish organizations and family members struggled to reclaim children from their wartime guardians. That was a response to violence. So I outlined the most negative aspects of Jewish survivors' lives in Poland in the first few years after liberation. I spoke about harassment, assaults, murders, pogroms. And these were motivated by myths of the so-called Jewish communism, of the belief in Jewish wealth, by blood libel, but also motivated by greed and by hatred. Jewish survivors, as we've seen, faced physical violence in Poland. They faced beatings, injuries, murder. They also faced psychological violence, threats, fear. Children suffered from severance from Catholic way of life that they came to know and in which they found solace. They suffered a break from their wartime identity. The children suffered separation from their foster parents in cases where there were emotional ties between the children and the parents. This continuance of violence and ongoing fear defined the lives of Jewish survivors in Poland. So these were the very negative things that I talked about. But at the same time, I would like to just point out, and something that we should keep in mind as well, that Jewish survivors attempted to rebuild their lives in Poland, and they managed to create a thriving Jewish culture, especially in the first years after the war. And I think that was also, we can view it as a response to violence, that despite everything, they wanted to live. They wanted to make Poland their home, and they wanted to create education institutions, cultural institutions, and so on. But as you know, this is a very fascinating topic of post-war Jewish life and how it was being rebuilt. But I think that is a topic for another time. So thank you very much.
That was well, I've been taking notes. That was fascinating. That was so interesting, and I really appreciate that at the end you did stress that there are positive narratives here. One of the things that stood out for me was just how those personal stories illustrated all of these very complicated choices, limited choices that many of these individuals had to navigate, both the children and the parents, and even Poles dealing with another what they perceived as occupation after a slew of occupations, very violent occupations. So thank you, Dr. Sliwa, that was fascinating. I do want to open it up for questions and encourage everyone to please utilize your chat box to ask any questions you may have of Dr. Sliwa. And I'm happy to kick us off and to exercise my own executive privilege. Something that really stood out for me was this idea of agency and how Jewish, and this is always an ongoing thing that I'm very fascinated by. So I'm going to ask you about this. The idea that Jewish survivors were able to exercise agency and navigate a very limited terrain in order to rebuild that thriving Jewish culture, form defense leagues, seek out family members, go and demand their children back, seek stolen property, reclaim their homes. I mean, it's just such a fascinating story. I'm just curious, can you say more about these efforts to exercise agency and how they were sometimes limited?
Okay, that is a great question, and I'm very happy that you picked on those various ways that Jewish survivors managed to exercise their agency, and indeed, their agency was very limited. It was limited because of the post-war situation in Poland, where people were demoralized by the violence of the 6 years. They were demoralized by what they had witnessed during those years, the persecution, the murder, the separations of families, and so on. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have Jewish survivors who were returning to their homes, right, trying to exercise their agency, and there you have Poles living in those homes who wanted to move on with their life. They acquired those apartments, those businesses, those homes. They didn't want to return them back. But I think what is remarkable, it was absolutely remarkable, and you touched upon it, Sarah, is that despite all of that, Jews really actively sought to remedy the situation in some way, to reclaim what was theirs, at least to try, right? And if something didn't work out, they found other ways to respond to the situation. If they couldn't live in their little hometown, they moved to a larger city. If the father couldn't take care of his children because he was ill, he didn't have any work, he didn't have a place to live, he placed them in a center, in a facility where the children received medical help, where they received education, where they were cared for. So I think looking at it, definitely looking at it in a broader perspective is very important.
Thank you. And it's just so fascinating given how the agency was so literally stripped in every aspect, public and private, from Jews. The fact that they were able to reclaim it and make demands, it's just such an amazing story. Thank you. We have a couple of questions. I'm going to go in order. Beth asks, do you know approximately how many Jews remain in Poland today, and what levels of anti-Semitism do they face?
So I like the fact that we have an acknowledgement that there is Jewish life in Poland today, because often, maybe until recently, sometimes there was no acknowledgement that there was Jewish life, or surprise that there is Jewish life in Poland today after all that what happened. But yes, so the numbers differ depending on who you ask. According to the official Polish census, there are about the last Polish census from several years ago, there are about 3,000 Jews in Poland, which it's not the correct number. Definitely is not. The census had was very flawed in the way they asked about your ethnicity, religious identity, or how you identify yourself in general. According to the chief rabbi of Poland, Michael Szudrych, there are about 50,000 Jews or even more in Poland today. The Jewish community in Poland is thriving. It's thriving especially in larger cities such as Warsaw, Kraków. Kraków has a very active Jewish community. Young people are joining joining the Jewish community. They are kind of finding out about their identity, reclaiming it for themselves. They're using their agency to go back to that notion. So in general, what I want to say is Jewish life today is thriving in Poland. In terms of anti-Semitism, of course, there is anti-Semitism in Poland, there is anti-Semitism in Germany, there's anti-Semitism in the US. And of course, Jews face anti-Semitism in Poland. I would be lying if I said they don't. But I just want to bring up an example of the Jewish Community Center in Kraków, which is considered a safe place and a welcoming place. And they have no security. You can enter. They want you to enter. They want you to be part of the community. So I think that speaks something to how the Jews, how some Jews in Poland and perhaps in some cities feel that they don't feel that threatened. They want to open up and they want people to get to know them.
Given the amount of security I have faced, encountered, and worked with when visiting Jewish communities throughout Europe, that in and of itself is really an impressive anecdote, that they do not have security at the Jewish Center there. That's amazing. There are a number of really amazing comments, but I'm going to stick to the questions for now. Colleen asks, can you tell us about the almost 30,000 Jews who stayed in Poland until approximately 1968? What was life like for them in those years? How did they view their Jewish identity? And why do you think they stayed?
That is a wonderful question. And my dear friend, Rachel Rothstein, she wrote a dissertation actually about this. She's working on a book about those Jews who stayed in Poland after the war, who stayed through the 1960s, the 1970s, 80s. And even though they faced the communist regime and attacks on the practice of religion, they persevered. And they continued to learn about Judaism. They continued to host holidays in their homes. They continued to be engaged in Jewish culture. So for these Jews, they did not have it easy. Okay, after in the 1950s, 1960s. There were waves of immigration from Poland when the communist government allowed immigration of Jews in the late 1950s. And then in 1968, there was an anti-Semitic called anti-Zionist campaign in Poland, where several thousand Jews were given one-way tickets. They were forced out of Poland. Among those people are, for example, Jan Tomasz Gross, the author of Neighbors and the author of Fear, who is a noted historian, American historian. So these were people who endured. Let's say those who left, those were people who endured a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of attacks against themselves, against their families, and they felt like they had no other option but to leave. And they had to submit their passports. They couldn't take many of their personal belongings with them. They were forced out of Poland. And for a long time, especially abroad, people thought, well, that was the end of Jewish life in Poland, 1968. That's it. No one remained. Everyone left, and that was not the case. Thousands of Jews did stay in Poland. They kept a low profile. they kept their identity, often they kept their identity a secret. They didn't tell their children, their grandchildren, that they were Jewish until later, or under deathbeds, for example, or the children and grandchildren found accidentally in some family papers that they had Jewish background. And the return to Jewish culture, to Jewish identity, to Judaism is a really fascinating story of the late 1980 that started in 1989 with the end of communism. But that's a fascinating part of the story for maybe another talk too.
I feel like I'm making a mental register in my mind of all of the other talks that we're going to have to do at some point. Anne Lynn asks, I have often regretted the fact that study of the Holocaust ends with liberation. So thank you for continuing the story. Is there more study these days in Holocaust scholarship, or more broadly, is there more study focusing on this period now?
Another great question. And I think, yes, I think that is let's say post-liberation, in the years immediately after the war, I think have garnered attention of scholars, of writers, and that time period is examined from different perspectives, for Poland, but also for other countries. For example, there is a very interesting book of our Sarah's and my colleague coming out in the fall, Elizabeth Anthony, about the return of survivors to Vienna. Okay, and why did they stay? Why did they decide to go back there? How did they rebuild their lives? So we see studies like that. We also see studies. There is another new it's a new book, and now I don't remember, but I think maybe in the follow-up email we can send some of those links about what happened to the displaced persons. Who were these people? How did they live their lives? So that's another study. But I would like to see more studies in this field, because you're right. We usually see a break, liberation, everyone is happy, everyone returns to their lives and is very successful and all that. And that's not the story. That's not the narrative. It was much more complicated than that.
Thank you. And I agree. I think that we are starting to see more careful study around the whole picture of the experiences of victims and survivors of the Holocaust. And it's such an important narrative, because if we end it as we would an event and we don't look at the processes and the continuance of violence that occurred to so many survivors trying to reclaim their lives afterwards, we're also missing an opportunity to celebrate their resilience and to honor the entirety of their narrative, that they went on and they struggled, and so many persevered. And I think some of those stories are really life lessons that we should be emulating in our daily lives. We have a follow-up question regarding the statistics of the number of people in Poland who recognize their Jewish ancestry and try to identify with their Jewish background. And actually a film called The Return by Adam Zucker was referenced. Can you speak to that a little bit? And I'm actually curious, I'm going to build on this to ask, did we see a resurgence in this reclaiming you mentioned of Jewish identity? Did we see that more so post 80s? Has it been continuous? Is there a marked resurgence at some point in Polish history?
Another great, wonderful question. I love all the questions. So yes, I highly recommend Adam Zucker's film, The Return. It follows the stories of three women who came to, one of them, well, she knew about being Jewish, but they came to kind of like reclaiming, let's say, their journey of reclaiming their Jewish identity, and what does that mean? What did that mean to each of these women? What paths did they choose? It's a fascinating documentary, and it's a few years old, so it's relatively recent. And in terms of timing, so when did this resurgence of Jewish life occur? One thing that I want to go back to what Colleen asked before, and I did not mention it then, is that in the 1960s and 70s, those who participated in Jewish life were, let's say, composed of two main groups. One, the more elderly people who were more cultural Jews. They belonged to this association of Jewish culture where they met, where they, for discussions, for just being together. They had their paper that was published, lectures and so on, but it was more cultural. And then you had children, let's say young people in their teenagers, maybe early 20s, whose parents were communists, right? Often either members of the Communist Party or who worked in the government. And these were young people who were rebels, who rebelled against their parents. And so they grew up in these atheist homes, very assimilated homes, but they wanted to find out more about their identity as a rebellion to their parents also. And these were young people who used, let's say, Jewish prayer books that were smuggled by members of Jewish organizations who came to Poland, right? And they brought in books, and they brought in books about Jewish culture, history, but also prayer books and other items for religious use. And so these were the people in the 70s and 80s, right? The children of communists, these rebels, who actually we owe the resurgence of Jewish life to them. They were the starter generation, okay? Because the older generation thought there is no real Jewish life. Like we will never return to what was before the war, and that's true. We will never return to what was before the war. But these young people tried to rekindle Judaism in Poland, and they managed to do that. So once communism in Poland, communist rule in Poland ended in 1989, there was more freedom to explore Jewish organizations from abroad, including the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, but also the Lauder Foundation, Ronald Lauder Foundation, created various programs in Poland to encourage people to return to their roots, to learn about their roots on their own, without imposing on them that you have to be Orthodox, that you have to practice in a particular way, or you have to identify in a particular way. They organized camps for children, kind of these getaways for families, to show them how do you light Shabbat candles? What do you say? What is a challah? These basics. And the resurgence of Jewish life is, we owe it also to Michael Shudrich, who continues to be the chief rabbi of Poland. He's an amazing individual, absolutely amazing for what he has been able to accomplish. And so today, thanks to the work over the years, today we have a really thriving life. We have Jewish community centers, visible Jewish community centers in Warsaw, in Krakow. We have Jewish activists, Jews who are taking on the roles of leaders in their communities.
That was such a wonderfully comprehensive response. Thank you. You took my muddled question and really built something beautiful out of it. Colleen asks, do you have any idea about the number of Holocaust survivors who are still alive in Poland today? And she references Krakow and the fact that there are a number of survivors who are very involved in the JCC there.
Yes, this is a very good question, and I probably should know this answer because I work for the Claims Conference, and we assist survivors all over the world. However, I do not know the exact number for Poland or for each country. I can check it and I can get back to you in a follow-up email. So definitely I can check the number. But as we know, the numbers of Holocaust survivors are dwindling, and in Poland, the situation is the same. In Krakow, so the last time I was in Krakow was in 2013. I was doing my research there, and there were about 100 Holocaust survivors at that time, and I think all of them were members of the the Association for Child Survivors of the Holocaust. So they were children during the war. And since 2013, they have been passing away. They've passed away, many of them, including Emanuel Elvinger. And I mentioned I knew him as Mundek. He was the sweetest man, and he passed away in 2017. He was, he spoke of himself also as the last Jew in Krakow who spoke Yiddish as his mother tongue. And this is a man where, when, for Shabbat dinners, and I'm a member of the Jewish Community Center in Krakow. So I attended all these holidays, and every time he would just stand up and he started singing in Yiddish, because he thought it was so important to pass on that, that kind of melody and the words onto the next generation. So we don't have him with us anymore. And the other survivors are frail and ill, many of them. However, I keep seeing pictures from the JCC in Krakow, and the survivors are are so active in their senior club, in their Child Survivor Association. The JCC is their home. They want to be there. And what is beautiful about Poland and the JCC there is that the seniors, so the Holocaust survivors, are very close to the younger generation. And the younger generation, the children, the teenagers, those in their 20s, 30s, the younger people, they want to be with the Holocaust survivors. They want to talk with them. They want to learn from them. They want to learn their stories. So I think that is very special.
I have another question, which is, what methods did survivors use to try and locate surviving family members after liberation? And were there Jewish organizations that tried to help reunite survivors, even if it was unsuccessful? And I'm going to add on to that, Jewish organizations both in Poland and also abroad, if you may.
So in terms of locating survivors, and that's another very important topic when talking about post-liberation. So how did people find each other? I know, Sarah, you will be talking about radio, the use of radio, right? Yes. So radio was one method, right? To post announcements to radio, but not everyone had a radio at that time. They were poor and they had often no place to live. So what happened was in cities throughout Poland, there were Jewish committees established. And these Jewish committees were set up to help survivors with finding a place to live, providing them with food and clothes, but also with reuniting survivors. So there would be lists hung out at these Jewish committee buildings. For example, someone is looking for their mother, last seen so-and-so. And so that was one way, lists. Another way was what I've seen postings in announcements in newspapers, in Jewish newspapers. So you have plenty of that. Also the word of mouth. And that's how many survivors found each other. Or people from the same town, maybe not family members, because most of them were separated, perished, and so they couldn't be reunited. In terms of Jewish organizations that were helping survivors, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee was the main organization when we speak of Poland, in Poland at the time, that was providing money, that was providing staff to kind of navigate the help. And the JDC also had to tread carefully. I mean, they were allowed to enter a communist country until 1949, I think 1949. And then they were kicked out by the communist regime. So the main organization was JDC, but there were also other organizations, American organizations, for example, even church groups that contributed to the JDC that then channeled the help to survivors in Poland.
So I have a question, a private question that was messaged to me. Can we view the loss of Jewish identity after the war as an example of ethnocide? Thinking about the idea that 90% of Polish Jews were murdered during the Holocaust, and then many more, those who survived, were forced to give up in many ways or lost their religion. What can we do as restorative measures today, or what can the Polish government do, also recognizing that it's an increasingly Catholic and restrictive government?
The question on ethnocide, I'm not sure that I can answer that. I think it's a really complicated question when we talk about ethnocide and what do we precisely mean by that. And when we talk about the forced, let's say, the assimilation of Jews into Polish society after the war, I'm not sure we can talk about ethnocide in this case. That was a choice that many Jews made, of course, prompted by the environment, by the political situation in the country, but it was a choice nevertheless. So I'm not sure that I would call it ethnocide. I think I would be careful with the terminology here, but it's an interesting concept to explore. And the second part of the question about measures to restorative measures. I would say this, that currently in Poland, there is this push for politics of history, meaning that the government the Polish government, which is a rightist government, is engaged in politicizing history. So for example, I mentioned Józef Kurash, pseudonym Fire, right? The one whose group attacked the Jewish children's home in Zakopane. We would think that he and his group would be considered perpetrators, right? They attacked a Jewish children's home. This would not be a person or a group that would be celebrated. Well, wrong, because by the definition of the current government and the politics of history that they are pursuing, this man, Józef Kurash and his partisan group, were heroes. They were anti-communist and they fought against communism. So he's celebrated. Okay. So I think when we talk about restorative measures, I think in the case of Poland, I think we should be talking about, historical truth, about history, about talking about what happened, about being open to talking about the less shiny aspects of Polish behavior during and after the war. That no country and no nation is only a nation of rescuers. That there are always shades of different behaviors. And I think that could contribute to restoring, it could be a restorative measure in the case of Poland, to have these discussions and have this understanding that Poland was not only a country of heroes.
I think you always step into some murky territory whenever a government is the one that's dictating what is official history and what is not. And especially when that official history runs counter to the testimonies and lived experiences and narratives of its own people. We have a couple of comments that I wanted to share with you just because I think that they're really key, and I want to make sure that we mention them and see if you have any responses to them. One is, it's just shocking how such violence could still occur immediately after the war and with the newly obtained knowledge that the Holocaust and all of these atrocities had occurred. So I'm going to spin that actually into a question, which is, was knowledge of the Holocaust widespread at that point? Did the Soviet occupiers allow for that knowledge to be widespread? What did, if you can even guess or ascertain, what did the average Polish citizen know?
A few years ago, there was a fascinating study that came out in Polish, not in, unfortunately, not in English, but in Polish, and about fear in the Polish society after the war, and about the brutalization of the Polish society immediately after the war. So the historian was trying to explain, why did Poles engage in this violence against their Jewish neighbors after the war? And why did they engage in violence against each other? And there were many reasons for that. And so when we talk about, the shock, it is shocking. It's absolutely shocking for all of us to hear this, that even after the war, even after knowing what happened during the Holocaust to the Jews and to the Poles, to the country as a whole, there was still violence, killings, murder, pogroms, rumors that turned into killing sprees. Why did that happen after the war? So brutalization by the war is one reason. The other reason is revenge, wanting to take revenge for what happened. Another reason would be greed. People wanted to keep what they acquired during the war. They did not want to give it back. For many Poles, many Poles believed that Jews should not. I'm sorry. I will go on to a next, because that's more complicated. So I will move on to the next question. But in any case, there were many different factors that contributed to this violence. And when we talk about knowledge, so that's something that I was aiming at, about knowledge of the Holocaust. We would think, right, that people who lived in villages, in towns, in cities, they witnessed the persecution of their Jewish neighbors, right? They had that knowledge. They saw when people were removed from their homes, expelled from their hometowns, when they were deported, when they were beaten on the streets, right? And also many Poles also witnessed the killings. They were young children often, they were hiding somewhere near the forest. They were curious, they wanted to see what was happening. So they did have that knowledge, and they did talk about it to others in their community. And we would think that this would kind of inhibit, stop them from engaging in violence. And one interesting argument that was put forward by the historian Jan Tomasz Gross in his book Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz, was that perhaps one of the reasons why Poles engaged in violence was that they were ashamed. They were sort of maybe ashamed of having witnessed the persecution of the Poles. I mean, of the Jews, right? They couldn't live with that, with having witnessed and done nothing. And that's an interesting argument to consider. So in terms of knowledge of the Holocaust among Poles after the war, it was impossible not to know. I mean, entire communities were wiped out. People knew, even children knew what happened to the Jews.
It's interesting. It actually reminds me of something that was said by a member of the Ministry of Justice in Rwanda after the genocide. And it was quite controversial, actually, because he asserted that everyone who had witnessed or experienced the genocide in Rwanda was traumatized, had been deeply traumatized somehow. And he included in that group both witnesses, victims, of course, but also the perpetrators, and argued that even the bystanders who chose to stand by and do nothing, and the perpetrators were deeply traumatized by what they had participated in, and that would have a lasting impact on their behavior moving forward. And so I think that's a lot of what you're speaking to when you talk about it, almost like a normalization of brutal behavior or shame. Maybe somewhere in there too is also some very severe trauma. Another comment is actually, it's a personal story. Gail says that her mother is first generation Polish American, and her grandmother felt that she had to change her last name when she came to America in order to make it sound less Polish in order to be accepted. So it's also an interesting point that for some Poles who fled as well, that they faced discrimination when they left and came to other countries. There's just so many great comments here. Here's another one actually who speaks about the chief rabbi of Poland, and notes that he actually recounted that many Christians who had hidden Jewish children and kept them actually admitted this on their deathbeds. And so there's been this very concerted effort, I guess, by the chief rabbi to go around and locate these children who were actually born of Jewish families but had never known it, because their parents had not survived or they were not reunited with them afterwards and told their identity. Do you know anything about those efforts?
Yes, so this is also a fascinating part of this when you talk about psychological violence, right? And trauma and fear, right? All combined into one, where yes, you had children who were hidden by their foster parents and they never knew about their identity. So I know plenty of examples like that. And some of the people will come forward and will go to the Jewish community and will go to the rabbi he's based in Warsaw to ask, what do I do with this knowledge? You know, the person who I thought was my parent told me that by the way, you're Jewish. I mean, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you change your life around when you're in your 40s, 50s? What does Jewish even mean? So the chief rabbi is a very, he's a unique person in the way he approaches these situations and the way that he talks with people and mentors them. And so one situation, there are plenty stories, and I could go on and on. One that I would like to mention is a child survivor, Elżbieta, and she was from the city of Tarnów, not too far from Krakow in southern Poland. And she did not learn about her Jewish identity until 1967 or so, when her parents passed away, and someone who knew about her, that she was not her parents' biological child, someone from the family thought that they had to let her know that this was the case. And you had Elżbieta, who was rescued as a baby from the Tarnów ghetto. She was placed in a church. A priest found her, and the priest placed her in a convent. And from that convent, a Polish couple adopted her and kept her throughout the war and did not return her to the Jewish community after the war. So you have this child, and she didn't know who she was. She still doesn't know. She has no documents. She only has the story told by a relative that she's not her parents' biological child, and that she's Jewish. So, I mean, living with that knowledge, that's what she told me, living with that knowledge is horrible when you don't know who you are. So one thing also that I did not specifically say here in the presentation, but for many child survivors, especially those who were hidden and who did not know about their identity, they will say, for me, the war began in 1945. Because that's when some of them were faced with the knowledge that they were not, that they had other families and another identity that was denied them.
Joanna, I'm going to have to follow up with you on the story of the young woman from Tarnów, because actually Change's board president is a second generation survivor and his family's from Tarnów, and they do an incredible amount there. And I know that he's going to want to connect with you and talk to you about this extensively. And so, but that's just amazing how, across a rather large pond, an ocean, here in America, we have stories and connections. It's still such a small world. I think I'm going to wrap up with one last question, just because I just saw it, and then I'm going to allow for Colleen to close us out for the evening, because this has just been such a wonderful start to our conference, and the conference continues on Thursday at 4 p.m. with a panel that's going to include a child survivor from Berlin and actually our Changes Board president whose family is from Tarnów, who will be speaking about his second generation experience and his family's narrative. But quickly, I have just completed reading Life in a Jar, how 3 students from a town in Kansas discovered Irina Sendler and her story of how she rescued 2,500 children from the Warsaw Ghetto. Has anyone followed the stories of these children?
Oh, I love this question. Okay, I love all these questions. They're wonderful, amazing. Okay, so Life in a Jar, the play about Irina Sendler, the Polish rescuer who rescued, well, and here we talked about myths in this presentation. Well, here you go with another myth. So the number that usually is given of the children that Irina Sendler rescued from the Warsaw Ghetto is 2,500, right? But we know that overall in Poland, 5,000 children survived the Holocaust in German-occupied Poland. So half of them would have survived, half of them would have been from Warsaw, from the Warsaw Ghetto. And there was one writer, journalist, writes, she wrote about Jedwabne, the town where Poles murdered Jews during the war in 1941. And that was, that was just an explosive study. And she decided to tackle this myth about Irina Sendler and the 2,500 children. And indeed, we want to believe in certain things, and we kind of just repeat them without sometimes thinking twice about what does that mean, and could that be true? Was that even feasible to rescue that many children from the Warsaw Ghetto alone? And so the writer challenges us to think about this differently, that perhaps there were less children. But these are numbers, right? In the end, Irina Sendler managed to rescue several hundred Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. And for that, that is to be celebrated. That her network of women, these were networks of women, a network of women, with some men, of course, who participated in it, they managed to operate this endeavor to enter the ghetto, find parents who would part with their children for an unknown amount of time, and children would be going to people that the parents didn't know. And then how do you smuggle these children? So the children were smuggled in these trucks, under things, right? In trucks. They were given sleep medication so they wouldn't cry, so they wouldn't ask questions. And there are several stories of children who were rescued this way. And these child survivors speak about their experiences. One famous story is, again, the survivor's name is Elżbieta, and now her last name escapes my mind, but Elżbieta. And all she had from her Jewish mother was a spoon, a silver spoon. That's it. That was her only memento of her mother. She was smuggled out of the ghetto as a baby by a woman who was part of Irina Sendler's network. And Elżbieta stayed with the woman, with the rescuer throughout the war. And after the war, when Jewish organizations were going around Poland trying to locate hidden Jewish children and reclaim them from foster parents and Catholic institutions, Elżbieta's foster mother fled from the city because she wanted to keep the child. She didn't want to give her up. And so Elżbieta stayed with her foster mother, whom she loved dearly, and she always speaks very highly of her. And this was the mother she knew. There are other stories of, there's a famous Polish writer, professor of Polish studies, Michał Głowacki, I think that's his name. It's his name. He wrote several books about his experiences, how he was smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto by the Sendler network, and he was placed in an orphanage run by Catholic institutions. So there are stories, of course. I think, well, many of those children don't know that they were rescued by the Sender network. We don't have a list, right, of all the children, and so some of those children were very little, and so they were placed with foster parents, and the foster parents, the ones that we just talked about, may not necessarily have told them that they were Jewish, right, or that they were rescued by this network. I mean, the less you knew, the better for your survival.
These are such tremendously complicated narratives and stories, but they're the stories that need to be told, because again, when we end our story of the Holocaust, or the teaching of the Holocaust with, and the camps were liberated and the cities were liberated, we miss this key continuance of violence through separation, anti-Semitism, physical violence, psychological violence. I mean, you touched upon so many incredible narratives. I'm not even going to try to, I wouldn't do them justice, but I'm going to leave it with thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sliwa, for such a tremendous talk. I want to now hand things over to send us home. I would like to bring in the Executive Board President of the Council of Holocaust Educators, the one, the only Colleen Tambusio. Colleen, thank you to you and your team for putting this together and for trusting us with a virtual program. I hope you're happy.
Oh, absolutely. We live in virtual land, so we know how to do this. And we're very happy, Joanna, that you could be with us tonight. This was absolutely wonderful. Brought up so many connections for our own teaching. And I think that the teachers will really appreciate going back to some of the resources. And just a couple of things I wanted to point out was the way in which Joanna put together the micro stories in the historical narrative, which is really how we address this in our classrooms. And tomorrow, Thursday, when we have a panel discussion, Change has put together a scrapbook resource that really follows the same format. It deals with a survivor story, but at the same time expresses the narrative, what was happening to this individual and this family at the time that that timeline approach that we use in the classroom. And that's very much what Joanna did tonight in this particular piece of history, which is something that we don't always get to with our students. Certainly, our time is always limited, even if we have a semester class, but certainly, as you can see here, an area that we really should devote some time to. Because last year we did our workshop was on the Kindertransport, and we saw the relevance of that work in terms of family separation. And family separation, as we learned last year at CHE, was a context that is not foreign to us today, because we're seeing that at our borders, and we're seeing what could potentially be the trauma that those young people live with throughout life. And when you mentioned, Joanna, the stories of people being returned, we all know those complicated stories. Some turn out well, some do not turn out well. Some of these kids struggle in the families that they go to, or their adoptive families. And I just wanted to point out that with the book, My 100 Children, I was able to, about, not this summer, the summer before, make contact with Lena's daughter, who actually lives in New York City, which is amazing. And she has, we talk quite a bit about her mother's story and the people that she helped save the children, because she goes back to Rabka and Zakopane, I think in 2000, with some of the children. Some of those children, most of the children went to Israel. Some of them came to America in adopted families, and I found one of them in Canada. And she speaks of what you spoke of. She didn't have a great life in this adoptive family. She struggled a lot. And I think that these are really important topics and relevant topics for our students today. I also put in the chat, because I think it really relates to the way in which Joanna can address Poland is always phenomenal. And I know Joanna knows this group, and I'm sure Sarah does too, the Forum for Dialogue in Poland, which they work with young Poles, and I've worked with them, and my students, we would have met with them. This actually, we were working on a project, but the pandemic came along, but we would have met with them in April in Rabka, and we were working on Lena's story. And the high school students from Rabka were going to take us to these places where she had this orphanage. But of course, that fell apart for now, but we're hoping, eventually it happens again. But there's a film link that Nicole found for me because my Chromebook wouldn't let me find it. It blocked it, that I just saw on a talk with the Forum for Dialogue. And I think, Joanna, you might have been on the call. You were on one of those forum calls, I think. No, you weren't on? Okay. So it's about these kids from this one community understanding the buildings in town and what was Jewish, what was owned by Jews there, and understanding the massacres that took place there. And they go and they do all this research. But why I really think you should watch it is not only you see this transformation in the students. As Joanna talked about these myths that people had then during and why these pogroms happened, these kids today had these myths as they were working in this program with the Forum for Dialogue. And the Forum for Dialogue teachers helped dispel those myths. And they transformed from thinking that, that hill over there where the Jews were killed is like a haunted house, right? They had these ideas in their head to who these people were and who they researched their lives. So they really personalized and sensitized the story. It's a short film. I think it's about 30 minutes. You can definitely use it in class and go watch it. You'll see a lot of connections to what Joanna was talking about in this talk, and certainly ways in which you can use that with your students. And I think students today, they relate to other kids and what are kids doing today in a country where the Holocaust happened? How are they dealing with their past? How do they deal with maybe having, perpetrator past in their families? And this group in Poland is phenomenal, and they've done a great job working with young students. Google it if you get a chance, Forum for Dialogue, and they're doing a lot of Zoom sessions. Actually, there's a whole series of 5 coming up, and they've been really wonderful. And that one they had the filmmaker and a former student who was in the program on the call. It was really good. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Change, for putting this together. Larry, it's nice to see you. It's nice to see everybody here. We can't have that interaction that we always do, but at least we can have the conversation about the topics that are important for us and important to bring to our students. So it was nice to see everyone.